On the study of cervical plexus, we are going to be having one of the ventral remi from C3, C4, and C5. The ventral remi of these plexuses, they are going to be making one of the most beautiful nerve, and that nerve is going to be innervating one of the most major inspiratory muscle, and this muscle is what we call the diaphragm. This nerve, which is formed by C3, C4, and C5, this one is what we call the phrenic nerve. Good evening to you all. My name is TUMNAD, and in today's video, we're going to be looking at what we call the spinal plexuses. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure subscribe. You turn on notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you're the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the spinal plexuses. We're going to be looking at the definition, the spinal regions, plexuses, and then the areas they are going to be supplying, okay? Now, we need to first understand what is a plexus. A plexus is simply a network of nerves that are formed by the ventral remi of the spinal nerves, okay? Because you're going to be having what we call the cross-section of the spinal cord that gives out to the ventral and then the dorsal root. When they unite, they form what we call a spinal nerve. Then a spinal nerve splits into the ventral remi and then the dorsal remi. It is the ventral remi that unites and gives what we call plexuses, okay? So now, here we have come up with a cross-section, we have come up with a diagrammatic illustration of the spinal cord. We want to see the different regions of the spinal cord. But we said that the spinal cord does not run throughout the vertebral column. It has somewhere it stops. And primarily, the spinal cord stops around L1 and L2. When the spinal cord reaches L1 and L2, it tries to tapas, okay? It narrows down. And we called that kind of the narrowing of the spinal cord as it ends, we called it conus medullaris, okay? And then at the end of the conus medullaris, you're going to be having now fibers of different spinal nerves coming off like horsetail. And we called that one as cauda equina, okay? If you have not yet watched that, please go and watch that one, okay? Now, we're going to be starting by naming these regions of the spinal cord. It has a total of 5 regions of the spinal cord. And all these regions are going to be giving out different spinal nerves, okay? And in different segments, okay? So now we have region A, region B, region C, region D, and region E. So now let's start with region A. This region A is what we call the cervical region, okay? Is what we call the cervical region. Okay, and the cervical region is going to give us 8 pairs of the cervical spinal nerves. Okay, and then this region B is what we call the thoracic region. Okay, is what we call the thoracic region. And this thoracic region is going to be giving us a total of 12 pairs of the spinal nerve. Okay, it's going to give us 12 pairs of the spinal nerve. And then this C is going to be now our lumbar region. Okay, it's going to be now our lumbar region. And this lumbar region is going to give us a total of 5 pairs of the spinal nerve. Okay, and then this region D is what we call the sacral region. Okay, and this sacral region is a fused bone, but it has holes that are going to give us the spinal nerves and a total of 5 pairs of the spinal nerves. Okay, and then the last region is going to be this one E at the down last end, and it gives us 1 pair of the spinal nerve. And this region is what we call the cox. Okay, is what we call the coccygeal. Region. Okay, the coccygeal region, and it gives us only a pair of spinal nerve. So now in total we're going to be having 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. Okay, in total we're going to be having 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. Okay, now having looked at these regions, it is through the ventral remi of these regions that we're going to be having what we call the plexuses, except for thoracic region. Thoracic region ventral remi does not form plexuses, with only exception of T1. But the rest, they go as intercostal muscles and supply different areas of the thoracic region and then the abdominal region walls. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see the different spinal plexuses that we have. We have a total of 4 main and then 1 minor ones. Okay, 4 main ones and then 1 minor ones, which most people don't talk about, but is also super very important. We have the first one. The first spinal plexus is what we call the cervical. Plexus. Okay, the cervical plexus. And then number 2 is what we call the brachial. Is what we call the brachial plexus. Okay, the brachial plexus. And then the number 3 is what we call the lumbar. Is what we call the lumbar plexus. Okay, then the 4th one is what we call the sacral plexus. Is what we call the sacral plexus. And then the last one, which most people don't talk about, but is also very important, is what we call the coccygeal. Okay, is what we call the coccygeal plexus. Okay, the coccygeal plexus. So we have a total of 5 spinal plexuses. But of course, don't forget we also have some other autonomic plexuses, like the enteric and then submucosal plexuses, which collectively make what we call the enteric nervous system. We shall not talk about that one, so come later and talk that one in detail during the study of what we call the enteric nervous system. Okay, part of the autonomic branch. Okay, so now having looked at these spinal plexuses, let's go ahead and see these plexuses one by one, anatomical location, and then the terminal nerve branches, and then the areas which are going to be supplying. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first plexus is going to be now our cervical. Is going to be now our cervical plexus. Now, we need to first understand which ventral remi are going to give us what we call the cervical plexus. Mainly, we are going to be having it coming from C1 up to C4. Okay, we are going to be having it coming from C1 up to C4. You may find some other books giving you C1 up to C5, because we are having certain kind of the nerve that shares fibers from C5, which is the phrenic nerve. Okay, so now we are going to be having this first. Now we want to see now what are some of those terminal nerve branches we are going to be finding in what we call the cervical plexus. We are going to be finding number 1. We're going to be finding these terminal nerve branches. The first one is going to be the phrenic. Okay, it's going to be the phrenic nerve. And this phrenic nerve mainly is going to be coming from what we call C3, C4, and then C5. That's why I said that you may find some people telling that the ventral remi of C1 up to C5. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now what other terminal nerve branches are we going to find here? You're going to be finding here what we call supraclavicular. Okay, supraclavicular nerve is also going to be part of the cervical plexus. We're also going to be finding what we call the ansa cervicalis. Okay, ansa cervicalis is also going to be part of the cervical plexus. We're also going to be finding what we call the lesser occipital. Okay, lesser occipital nerve. And then the last one is going to be what we call the greater auricular nerve. Okay, so now we may have even more than these, but these ones are a must to know in what we call the terminal branches of the cervical plexus. Okay, so now what are those main areas which are going to be supplied by this cervical plexus? Mainly, we are going to be having what we call the diaphragm. We're going to be having what we call the diaphragm. And of course, for the case of the diaphragm, is one of the main inspiratory muscle going to be supplied by what we call the phrenic nerve. Okay, we also have what we call the neck muscles. We have the neck muscles. We also have part of the shoulder. Okay, part of the shoulder, and then even also parts of the head. Okay, so now these are the areas which are going to be supplied by this cervical plexus. It supplies a lot, but if you have to forget others, please do not forget these main areas supplied by what we call the cervical plexus. So now let's go ahead and see the second cervical plexus. That was our cervical plexus. It was number 1. Then let's go ahead and see the second cervical plexus. Okay, so now the second spinal plexus is going to be the brachial. Okay, is going to be the brachial. Now, which ventral remi give us the brachial plexus? Mainly, we're going to be having it coming from C5 all along up to T1. Okay, these are the ventral remi of these spinal nerves that are going to give us what we call the brachial plexus. Now, we need to know what are some of those terminal nerve branches that are going to be part of the brachial plexus. We have very many, but if you forget, do not forget the following. The first one is what we call musculocutaneous. Okay, musculocutaneous. Okay, musculocutaneous. And if you want to know, musculocutaneous is going to be more of sensory. Okay, another one is going to be now the axillary. Okay, is going to be the axillary nerve. Okay, another one is going to be the what we call the medial. Is going to be the medial or the median nerve. Okay, another one is going to be the radial. Another one is going to be the radial nerve, and then the last one is going to be what we call the ulnar. Okay, what we call the ulnar nerve. We may have a very simple acronym, and this acronym is going to be MAM. Okay, and this acronym can give you a remembrance acronym or technique to remember this one, being the musculocutaneous, axillary, the radial, the median, and then the ulnar. Okay, it's an acronym that can help you remember these terminal branches under the brachial plexus. What are some of those areas which are going to be supplied by this brachial plexus? The most important ones which you need to remember is going to be the upper limb. Okay, it's going to be what we call the upper limb. Okay, the upper limb. What else? The forearm. Okay, the forearm. What else? Parts of the shoulder. Okay, some parts of the shoulder. And then also, mainly, these are some of the areas that are going to be supplied. And of course, these plexuses, they're going to be having the motor fibers or motor supply and then the sensory supply. And mainly, the sensory supply is going to be mainly on the skin. And then the motor supply is going to be mainly on what we call the muscles. And also, mainly what we call the skeletal muscles. Okay? So now, this is the brachial plexus. Let's go ahead and see the third plexus. Okay? The third plexus. Now, what do you think is going to be our third plexus, and what do you think is going to be contained in the third plexus? The third plexus is what we call the lumbar plexus. Okay, is what we call the lumbar plexus. Now, which ventral remi give us the lumbar plexus? Mainly, you're going to be finding in many authors or even very many sources, they are going to be giving you what you call from L1 up to L4, okay? But do not hesitate if you find some other sources giving you T12 all along up to L5, okay? You should not hesitate if you find these kind of people that are going to be giving you T12 up to L5, because we have very, very, very little, some tiny fibers that are going to be contributing in the formation of different terminal nerve branches. Okay, now like T12, it's going to be the subcostal nerve, which is going to be innervating the abdominal wall, the muscles like the internal oblique, external oblique, the rectus abdominis, the transverse abdominis, the epididyminalis, okay, epididyminalis, and all that. Okay, so now let's look at the terminal nerve branches which are going to be part of the lumbar plexus. We are going to be having very many nerves, but if you forget, don't forget this. The first one is what we call the obturator. Is what we call the obturator. What we call the obturator. Okay, obturator nerve. Okay, what we call obturator nerve. Okay, the spelling is what we call obturator nerve. Okay, the second one is going to be the femoral. Okay, it's going to be the femoral nerve. The third one is going to be the genitofemoral. Okay, the genitofemoral nerve. And then the fourth one is going to be what we call the laterocutaneous. Okay, laterocutaneous nerve. And then the last one is going to be what we call the ilioinguinal. Okay, ilioinguinal nerve. And we also have another one which we call the iliohypogastric. They're all going to be part of what we call the terminal branches, nerve branches of what we call the lumbar plexus. Okay, so now what are those areas which are going to be supplied by what we call the lumbar plexus? If you forget, do not forget these ones. The first one is going to be the anterior thigh. is going to be the anterior thigh. The second one is going to be the medial, thigh. Okay, the medial thigh. The third one is going to be the knee. The fourth one is going to be the areas of the groin. Okay, and then even also part of the abdominal wall muscles. Okay, so now the lumbar plexus is going to be supplying these areas. If you forget, do not forget these areas that are going to be supplied by what we call the lumbar plexus. So now let's go ahead and see our spinal plexus number 5. What do you think is going to be our spinal plexus number 5? And of course, that's going to be now our sacral plexus. Now, the sacral plexus, it is also one of the most important spinal plexus because it is going to be containing one of the most largest nerve in the body, which we call the sciatic nerve. And this kind of the plexus is what we call the sacral plexus. And the sacral plexus, mainly the ventral remi that give us the sacral plexus, is from L4 all up to S4. Okay, we are going to be having the ventral remi, which are going to be coming from this kind of the spinal nerves. So now let's look and see what are those kind of the terminal nerve branches that are going to be part of the sacral plexus. The first one which I want you to know and don't forget is what we call sciatic. Okay, is what we call sciatic. And this sciatic nerve is going to be giving us two main branches. What are these two branches? We have what we call the tibial branch, and then we also have what we call the common fibular nerve. Okay, and they're going to be supplying different areas. What else? We also have what we call the pudendal nerve. We also have what we call pudendal nerve. Okay, and this pudendal nerve is going to be even carrying some fibers of the parasympathetic nerve fibers that are going to be supplying different areas like the external urethral sphincter, external anal sphincter, and all that. What else? You're going to be having what we call the superior, and then the superior and then inferior gluteal. Okay, superior and inferior gluteal nerve. And of course, in mind, you have to bear it that it's going to be supplying what we call the buttocks. Okay, and then the last one is what we call the posterior cutaneous. Okay, is what we call the posterior cutaneous. Okay, posterior cutaneous, which is going to be part of the sensory fibers. What are some of those areas which are going to be supplied by these kind of the sacral plexus? The first one is going to be the leg, and then the second one is going to be the parts of the pelvis. It's going to be supplying external anal sphincter, and then also external urethral sphincter. Okay, and it's also going to be supplying parts of the perineum. Okay, the parts of the perineum, and it's also going to be supplying the posterior thigh. Okay, the posterior thigh. This kind of the sacral plexus is super very important. If you have a damage with the sciatic nerve, you may have troubles in moving, or you may even not move completely. Okay, so now if you have to forget the area supplied by the sacral plexus, please do not forget this. Let's go ahead and see now the fifth last minor plexus, which we are calling the coccygeal plexus. It is also worth to be known because it is also super very important. And we have said that this kind of the plexus is what we call the coccygeal plexus. And this plexus is going to be mainly coming from what we call S4, S5, and then also the cox. Okay, S4, S5, and then the cox. Okay, S4, S5, and then also the cox. Those are the ventral remi that are going to be making what we call the coccygeal region. And this kind of the coccygeal plexus is going to be mainly supplying the skin, over the cox. okay, over the cox. That's generally its main role. Okay, so now having looked at now all the plexuses, we also have what we call the thoracic nerves. The thoracic spinal nerve, they don't make plexuses except T1. They move as independent intercostal nerve and they can supply the thoracic wall. Okay, thoracic wall skin and then also the motor part of the thoracic muscles. Of course, we have the internal and then external, internal and external muscles, which are going to be aiding in what we call the breathing mechanism. Okay, so now having looked at all that, this covers what we call the spinal plexuses. Um, if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me. And there are a couple of ways that you can do that. You can like the video, comment in the comment section. You can even share the video to people whom you think this video is helpful. And don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD from the beginning up to the end. And of course, as always, until we meet next time.